The golden light of the Emperor's throne flickered with a barely perceptible pulse, casting long, wavering shadows across the vast hall of the imperial palace. The air was thick with a sense of expectancy, a silence so profound it pressed on the mind as though it had weight. The throne itself, a marvel of incomprehensible engineering and arcane psychic power, held the Emperor in eternal vigil, a figure of immovable authority and divine will. His eyes were closed, the faintest glow of psychic energy rippling around his form like heat waves over a sun-scorched desert. Despite the apparent stillness, the Emperor's mind stretched across the Imperium, sensing, guarding, calculating. Every heartbeat of humanity, every tremor of war, every flicker of treachery across countless worlds registered within his awareness. He sat in serene meditation, a calm island amidst the ceaseless tide of war, yet even here, within the heart of the Imperium, shadows crept, and the subtle tendrils of chaos whispered in the corners of reality where even the Emperor's gaze did not reach. Around him, the Custodians moved with the precision and elegance of living statues. Each step was measured, deliberate, a silent testament to the discipline and perfection that had been cultivated over millennia. Their golden armor reflected the ambient light in sharp, dazzling glints, each plate etched with runes of loyalty, wards of protection, and sigils of the Emperor's undying grace. As they marched through the corridors, the sound of their boots striking the polished marble echoed like a metronome, a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the very heartbeat of the palace itself. There was no hesitation, no flaw, no faltering. They were the embodiment of martial perfection. Yet within their eyes, the faintest flickers of individuality could be glimpsed, tiny, almost imperceptible, but there nonetheless. They were human in a sense that most of the galaxy could no longer comprehend, and their humanity lent them a weight, a presence that went beyond mere instruments of war. It was in the way they held themselves, the way a glance could communicate 1,000 unspoken words, and the way their loyalty radiated like a psychic aura, invisible, yet palpable to those attuned to the subtle forces that flowed through the palace's veins. Unbeknownst to the Custodians, and even to the Emperor himself, a threat far subtler and more insidious than any weapon of steel or plasma had begun to infiltrate the heart of the palace. Typhus, the herald of Nurgle, moved unseen, not through corridors or doors, but through the very air itself. Microscopic spores, almost impossible to detect, drifted silently on currents of warm, recycled air, slipping through cracks in the ancient stone and oozing into the labyrinthian ducts and hidden chambers of the throne world. Each spore was a seed of decay, a harbinger of corruption, carrying with it the slow inevitability of rot, disease, and psychic taint. They clung to surfaces, settled in hidden niches, and waited for the perfect moment to awaken the horror within. There was no sound to betray their presence, no visible shimmer to mark their passage, only the faintest shift in the air, a whisper of something alien and wrong. The spores were patient, and patience was a weapon Typhus wielded with unmatched precision, for he understood that the greatest victories were often won not with immediate destruction, but with quiet, inexorable infestation. The hallways, pristine and gleaming, seemed almost to breathe as if the palace itself were alive, aware of the intruders moving in the air. The Custodians, unknowing, continued their march, their conversation muted but filled with subtle signs of camaraderie. One remarked on the slight chill in the hall, another commented on the strange shimmer of the light against the walls, but such observations were quickly dismissed, attributed to the quirks of the ancient structure. And yet, in the spaces between their measured steps, in the corners of their awareness they did not fully trust, there was a flicker of unease. It was the kind of unease that only those trained to perceive the smallest threats could sense, and even then it was more instinct than conscious thought, a whisper in the mind that something was off, though nothing could be seen, touched, or fully comprehended. It was the first stirrings of a shadow, the beginnings of a corruption that would test their resolve in ways no blade ever could. Every detail of the palace seemed to emphasize both grandeur and fragility. The floors, polished to a mirror sheen, reflected the golden armor of the custodians in endless repetition, creating a sense of infinite vigilance, infinite duty. The walls were lined with statues of past heroes, angels of the emperor who had walked these halls and who now served as silent reminders of the weight of loyalty and sacrifice. Each statue's eyes, carved with impossibly fine detail, seemed to follow the custodians, watching, judging, inspiring. The ceilings arched impossibly high, draped with banners depicting the victories and tragedies of millennia, their colors dimmed by the relentless passage of time, but their symbolism eternal. Every element of the palace was designed not merely for function, but for psychological impact, to remind those within that they were part of something greater, something sacred, and something worth defending with every breath, every heartbeat, every drop of blood. Amidst this perfection, the spores of Typhus moved like shadows in daylight, utterly invisible, yet palpably wrong in a way that affected the air itself. The custodians, for all their discipline, could not sense the microscopic invaders directly, but the palace, old and sentient in ways only partially understood, seemed to react. The very stones whispered faintly, vibrations in the floor transmitted subtle tremors, and the faintest flicker of light in the hallways seemed to warp in unnatural ways. It was as though the palace itself was straining against the intrusion, attempting to protect its master, yet even it could not entirely prevent the creeping horror. And so the spores of Typhus moved silently onward, hitching themselves to the air, settling invisibly upon the golden armor of humanity's finest warriors, carrying with them the seeds of decay that would one day bring a storm the likes of which even the emperor could scarcely contain. As the scene unfolded, the camera, were this a cinematic visualization, would move slowly, deliberately, hovering over the emperor's calm, unflinching visage, tracing the gleam of armor in the halls, following the invisible currents of taint in the air. The mood was almost unbearably tense, a quiet before the storm so dense that every step, every breath, every flicker of light seemed to carry the weight of inevitability. The audience, fully aware of what the spores represent, even if the characters are not, feels the rising dread, the suspense that something perfect and invulnerable is about to face a challenge utterly unlike any before it. It is a calm built on fragility, on the knowledge that perfection can mask weakness, and that even the golden warriors of the Emperor are not immune to the slow, creeping horror that is about to engulf them. In this space, the stage is set. The Emperor remains a paragon of power, his psychic aura a bastion of hope and authority, yet even he is unaware of the microscopic threat slipping into the very halls meant to protect him. The custodians march with precision and pride, embodiments of discipline and human excellence, yet the seeds of corruption cling invisibly to them, an unseen chain that will bind even the mightiest to despair. The audience, drawn into this grim tableau, understands the stakes intuitively. What begins here, in silence, with imperceptible spores, will grow into a tempest of horror, violence, and despair that will challenge the very foundations of the Imperium itself. The golden halls, the statues, the banners, the very air itself, everything is a prelude to chaos, a calm before the storm, and a promise that no loyalty, no discipline, no perfection can withstand the patient inevitability of Typhus's malice. The first sign of something wrong came as a barely perceptible cough, a sound so slight that it could have been dismissed as nothing more than a tickle in the throat or the echo of air moving through the vast halls. One of the custodians, a towering figure in polished gold, paused mid-step, his hand instinctively moving to cover his mouth. The others, disciplined as they were, noticed immediately. Eyes sharpened, heads tilted in a silent inquiry. There was a pause, almost imperceptible, a tension that rippled through the line of guardians like a tremor in still water. In the polished corridors of the imperial palace, where every motion was deliberate and every step precise, even the smallest deviation drew attention. The custodian who had coughed straightened, mask of perfection returning, yet a faint twitch lingered in the fingers, a tremor in the hands, a slight hesitation in the posture. These were imperfections, anomalies that should not exist in beings engineered for absolute control and mastery over their own bodies. The moment passed, almost, and yet it did not. Shadows seemed to stretch slightly, unnaturally along the walls, flickering in the golden light that bathed the hallways. There was a subtle shift in the air, a prickling at the edges of perception, almost like a whisper brushing against the consciousness of those attuned to the subtleties of danger. The spores that Typhus had sent forth had found a host, and the custodian's body, perfect though it was, had no defense against the slow, insidious corruption that was now beginning to spread invisibly through the airways into the very essence of life that animated him. There was no immediate collapse, no sudden scream, no dramatic convulsion. The true horror was in the imperceptibility, the gradual invasion of the body by something alien, something that was both biological and psychic in its malevolence. It was subtle, deliberate, and therefore far more terrifying, for there was no immediate enemy to fight, no visible monster to strike down, only the knowledge that the perfection of the Emperor's guardians was now vulnerable to an unseen predator. The other custodians, trained to notice every detail, could sense the slight irregularities. One of them adjusted the weight of his halberd in his hands, the motion smooth but loaded with alertness. Another's gaze lingered on the trembling fingers, a shadow of suspicion crossing the otherwise impassive expression. The silence between them grew taut, a wire stretched to its limit. There was a hesitation, a pause in the rhythmic march, the kind that would be noticed in any other context, but here felt like a crack in the very foundation of discipline. Eyes flickered from one golden figure to another, searching for confirmation or dismissal, for a sign that the anomaly was nothing, or for evidence that it might be the herald of something far worse. They did not speak, for their training demanded stillness, control, and silent observation before action, yet their bodies betrayed a subtle tension that spoke louder than words. It was then, in the subtle tremor of the hands, the almost imperceptible faltering of breath, that the first whispers of fear began to crawl through the hallways. Not audible words, not yet, but the sensation of memories and warnings embedded in their psychic attunement, the lessons of countless battles, the echoes of past plagues that had scarred the galaxy, the awareness that disease could be as merciless and intelligent as any blade. These memories, dormant and rarely needed, stirred now like embers fanned into life by the faintest draught. The custodians themselves may have been perfect, but they were still human beneath the augmented strength, the perfect reflexes, the golden armor. And humans, even the most disciplined, were susceptible to fear, to doubt, and to horror when confronted with the unknown. The infected custodian's breathing grew slightly heavier, a shallow, almost imperceptible rasp that went unnoticed by anyone untrained in the subtle signs of biological corruption. His eyes, hidden behind the polished lenses of his helm, flickered with something foreign, an almost imperceptible distortion in the gleam that had always been a reflection of clarity and unwavering loyalty. The others in the formation noticed the shift immediately, not consciously, perhaps, but in the way instincts register before logic, in the fine, unspoken signals that pass between warriors who have fought together for centuries. The moment was brief, but it was enough for tension to ripple outward, subtle as a stone dropped into a still pool, spreading unease to those around him. Each step he took seemed slightly off, a microsecond behind the rhythm, yet it was enough to prick at the subconscious awareness of the others, a warning signal they could not yet name. As they continued their patrol, a soft, almost imperceptible haze of spores drifted past the polished floors, unnoticed even as it settled on the edges of the custodian's armor. They moved with the lightest currents, curling in the corners of the hall, drifting along the reflective surfaces of the walls and statues, invisible yet present. The spores carried with them the promise of decay, of corruption, of a slow and relentless transformation that no armor, no gene seed, no centuries of training could withstand. And still, nothing visible betrayed their presence, only the faint cough, the subtle twitch, the shadow of doubt that crept into the minds of those around the first infected custodian. It was a horror not of immediate spectacle, but of anticipation, the dread of inevitability, the knowledge that perfection could be corrupted from within, quietly and without warning. Some of the custodians adjusted their stances, a subtle choreography of vigilance that communicated concern without words. A shift of a foot here, a tilt of the head there, tiny gestures, almost invisible, yet heavy with meaning. The bond between these warriors, honed over millennia, allowed them to perceive these slight anomalies instantly. Still, no accusation was spoken, no alarm sounded. They understood instinctively that haste could provoke unnecessary panic, that order must be maintained even in the face of the unknown. And yet, within the disciplined ranks, a quiet tension coiled like a serpent ready to strike, feeding off uncertainty and the first flickers of fear that had entered their minds. Even the palace seemed to sense the intrusion. The shadows in the corners deepened, stretching unnaturally in the flickering golden light, as though the very walls were aware of the corruption that had begun. The polished floors reflected not only the custodians themselves, but also something darker, a subtle warping in the light that the untrained eye would dismiss as a trick of perspective, yet which the mind of a warrior tuned to perfection could not ignore. The whispers of past horrors, the Black Plague, the taint of chaos, the unseen foes that had brought entire worlds to ruin, stirred in the psychic awareness of the custodians, threading fear into the rigid discipline that had until now been absolute. By the time the formation reached the far end of the corridor, the tension had woven itself into the very air. Every step echoed not only on the marble, but also in the collective consciousness of the warriors. Each breath was measured, each glance deliberate, every movement a balance between calm and vigilance. The first spore had done its work. It had introduced doubt, uncertainty, and fear into the heart of the Emperor's most loyal servants. The horror of the moment was not in bloodshed, not yet. It was in the knowledge that something imperceptible had breached the ultimate defenses, that the Golden Guardians, embodiments of loyalty and perfection, were now vulnerable to forces no weapon could touch, no training could prepare them for. The slow, inexorable sense of dread, subtle yet all-consuming, had begun to take hold. Even as the shadow of unease began to creep through the halls, the custodians strove to maintain their composure, moving with the disciplined grace that had been drilled into them for centuries. Yet beneath the polished gold and flawless technique, small fragments of humanity shone through, reminders that these warriors, perfect though they seemed, were still living beings, capable of loyalty, camaraderie, and even fleeting joy. They shared subtle gestures of connection, a nod, a brief glance, a slight shift in stance that spoke volumes in silence. In the context of the Imperium, such moments of human warmth were rare, but here, in these sacred halls, they reminded each other of what they fought for, of the Emperor who had entrusted them with his protection, and of the fragile beauty of a galaxy that demanded guardians, even as it scorned them. These were not merely soldiers, they were brothers in arms, bound by duty and mutual respect, and in their fleeting interactions lay the seeds of profound emotional resonance that would soon be tested to the extreme. A few custodians exchanged quiet banter, voices low but tinged with the rare warmth of shared humor. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to an outsider, yet to those trained in the subtleties of body language, it spoke of deep trust and familiarity. One made a comment about the eternal polishing of their armor, a wry acknowledgement of the absurdity of spending centuries perfecting reflections while the galaxy burned outside the palace walls. Another responded with a rare smile beneath his helm, a fleeting gesture that transformed the rigid facade of stoicism into something recognizably human. In these small moments, the Custodians revealed the paradox of their existence. They were beings designed for perfection and deathless vigilance, yet they clung to the fleeting traces of humanity that allowed them to connect, to care, and to feel the weight of their solemn duty. The audience, witnessing these interactions, began to understand the stakes not merely as a matter of martial confrontation, but as an emotional investment in beings whose lives, loyalty, and essence were about to be threatened by a horror they could neither see nor fully comprehend. As the group moved deeper into the palace, their eyes continually flicked to one another, monitoring for signs of imperfection, hesitation, or weakness. The first custodian to falter subtly, coughing under the invisible influence of Typhus's spores, had already set a quiet tension among the ranks. The others watched him not only with professional vigilance, but also with concern born of shared history and camaraderie. Their loyalty was absolute, but loyalty in this context was not merely obedience, it was care, a willingness to lay down their lives for one another and, ultimately, for the Emperor. In the slightest tremor of a hand, in the near-miss glance of fear, the audience could see the emotional weight carried by each guardian. These were not automatons. They were sentient, feeling beings, acutely aware of the fragility of life and the horrors that awaited even those most exalted. The narrative tension deepened as subtle acts of humanity began to punctuate the disciplined march. One custodian paused, almost imperceptibly, to adjust the position of a fallen banner, smoothing it as though honoring the centuries of service and sacrifice it represented. Another offered a silent nod of approval, a recognition of the care and respect being shown in a task that might seem trivial but was imbued with significance. The audience felt the intimacy of these gestures, the connection between perfection and vulnerability, discipline and emotional resonance. Here, in the echoing halls of a palace that had seen millennia of war, the custodians' humanity was laid bare, not through speech, but through the smallest acts of attention and awareness, subtle indications of the depth of their loyalty and the breadth of their care. Yet even in these moments of warmth and connection, the spores continued their silent work. They drifted unnoticed along the polished floors, curling along the edges of the custodians' armor, infiltrating the air around them and embedding themselves in places that no guardian could reach or cleanse. It was a quiet, insidious threat, one that contrasted sharply with the visible perfection of the warriors and the serene authority of the Emperor. The tension was palpable. The audience, already attuned to the horror, understood that the bond, the loyalty, and the humanity on display were now the very things that would be tested. Would these beings, so perfect and devoted, be capable of resisting an invisible corruption that attacked not just their bodies, but their very essence? The suspense hung in the air, thick and oppressive, an invisible fog of anticipation that mirrored the unseen spores themselves. As they proceeded, the custodians' interactions revealed not only camaraderie, but also a profound sense of purpose and identity. One shared a memory from a campaign long past, a fleeting story of sacrifice that had been shared in whispers among the ranks, and the others listened with silent reverence. These stories were more than anecdotes. They were reminders of the price of loyalty, the weight of duty, and the moral compass that guided their existence. They laughed quietly, a sound almost forbidden in the solemn halls, yet it was necessary, an emotional counterpoint to the pervasive tension, a fragile beacon of life amid the creeping dread. The audience felt the resonance of these moments, understanding that the horror to come would not only test their physical might, but also threaten the very bonds that defined their existence. As the first hints of fear began to manifest, slight twitches, subtle hesitations, and the awareness that something imperceptible had infiltrated their ranks, the Custodians' humanity shone even more brightly. They were not yet infected, not yet corrupted, and it was this very combination of perfection and vulnerability that made the impending threat all the more terrifying. They were capable of profound bravery, yet they were also capable of suffering, of loss, of fear. The audience, emotionally invested in these warriors, sensed the mounting suspense and the emotional stakes. The horror of what was to come would not be measured in mere casualties or shattered armor, but in the betrayal of trust, the corruption of the body and spirit, and the devastation of the loyalty and love that bound them together. The Emperor himself, serene upon the throne, remained the anchor of their devotion, the ultimate symbol of purpose and direction. His presence imbued them with confidence and courage, yet it was also a reminder of the magnitude of what was at stake. They were not simply fighting for themselves or for survival. They were guardians of something eternal, something that represented the very soul of humanity across the stars. The emotional resonance of this duty heightened every gesture, every glance, and every shared moment, magnifying the suspense and horror of the slow-moving threat that Typhus represented. Even as laughter, camaraderie, and shared stories punctuated the march through the halls, the spores continued their invisible work. They settled silently into the air, in crevices, and upon the surfaces of armor and flesh, preparing to unmake the perfect beings who were so deeply defined by their loyalty and humanity. The juxtaposition was stark. Golden guardians, embodiments of strength, courage, and moral certainty, and an unseen, creeping corruption that could unravel centuries of discipline with invisible, insidious persistence. The audience, fully aware of the looming threat, was drawn into the suspense, the emotional weight, and the grim beauty of the moment. Every smile, every nod, every gesture of care was now a fragile beacon in the shadow of the horror that was silently encroaching. By the time the Custodians reached the end of their patrol, the scene had fully established the emotional stakes, the suspense, and the looming horror. They were loyal, perfect, and deeply human. They were warriors and brothers. They were the Emperor's closest protectors. Yet they were now vulnerable in ways neither they nor the Emperor could foresee. The subtle cracks in their armor of discipline, the slight tremors of unease, and the invisible spores all pointed toward the coming nightmare. A nightmare that would test not just their martial prowess, but the very essence of who they were. In these moments, the audience felt the full weight of dread, attachment, and suspense, primed for the horrors that would soon descend upon the Golden Throne and its imperiled guardians.
The first custodian to succumb did so in a moment that seemed to stretch time itself. He had been mid-ritual, performing the silent, disciplined motions that were second nature to every guardian of the Emperor, when the corruption that had lain dormant within him ignited with unbearable force. His limbs jerked unnaturally, contorting in ways that no human body, augmented, engineered, or enhanced, should ever endure. Golden armor groaned under the strain of impossible movements, joints bending against their design as if the very metal were being reshaped by some unseen hand. The hall, normally echoing with the rhythmic precision of movement and the quiet authority of absolute control, was pierced by the sharp, unnatural crack of armor plates breaking, of sinew and tendon stretching beyond reason. His eyes, once calm and steadfast, flared with a sickly greenish glow, the unmistakable mark of plague taint that radiated not only corruption but psychic agony. From within, he seemed to burn with a psychic fire, a warking energy that whispered promises of pain and death, twisting his mind even as it desecrated his body. Those standing nearest froze, uncertainty flashing across their perfectly disciplined faces as the horror of what was happening before them eclipsed every instinct honed over centuries. The whispers began almost immediately, voices threading through the psychic resonance of the hall, voices that should not exist, speaking words that were impossible to hear, yet impossible to ignore, promises of power, fear, betrayal, decay. The other custodians were caught between duty and the sudden visceral panic that erupted within their ranks. Some moved instinctively, rushing to their comrade's side, hands extended not in aggression, but in the desperate hope of saving him from the creeping rot that had already begun to claim him. Others stepped back, weapons raised with the rigid professionalism ingrained over millennia, prepared to strike if necessary. The psychological torment of the moment was immense. To hesitate meant risking corruption. To act without clarity could mean destroying one of their own. Loyalty, duty, and love, rare though it was in these warriors, clashed violently with the instinctual need for survival. The whispers from the warp intensified, threading doubt and fear into the minds of those nearby, insinuating that even these golden warriors, chosen and perfected, were not immune to betrayal or death. Every thought, every hesitation, every flicker of indecision was magnified in the minds of the custodians, as if the very air around them had become a psychic crucible of fear. The audience feels it acutely, not just the physical horror, but the immense psychological strain, the ethical quandary of whether to save or destroy, and the creeping realization that even perfection has its limits when faced with an unseen, omnipotent enemy. As the collapse continued, the hall became a theater of grotesque transformation. The infected custodian's armor twisted and bent, fused with his flesh in places as greenish ichor began to seep from the cracks in his plating. His limbs flailed, snapping at impossible angles, clawed hands tearing at his own body as the corruption consumed him from within. The psychic whispers grew louder, a cacophony that clawed at the minds of all present, filling the hall with the sense that reality itself was unraveling. Fellow custodians struggled to maintain composure, their golden visors reflecting the sickly green glow in a manner that seemed almost to mock them. Time felt distorted, elongated by the intensity of the moment. Some whispered prayers under their breath, invoking the Emperor, their voices shaking with fear despite the veneer of absolute control. Others clenched their weapons tighter, knuckles white beneath their gauntlets, ready to strike if the corruption tried to extend further. And yet the horror was not only in the transformation of one of their own, it was in the terrifying thought that the very essence of what made them custodians, loyalty, discipline, unity, could be twisted and turned against them.
From the Emperor's throne, psychic tremors registered faintly, subtle ripples in his consciousness that hinted at disturbance but lacked the immediacy required for intervention. He could sense the turmoil, the violation of his guardians, yet the psychic reach of Typhus's corruption was maddeningly localized and cunning, evading his direct perception. It was a cruel irony. The very guardians who existed to defend him, whose lives were defined by unwavering vigilance, were being undone beneath his gaze, and there was nothing he could do to intervene directly. The audience feels the tension double here, witnessing both the horror of the custodian's suffering and the agony of the Emperor, a godlike figure trapped in helpless observation. The hall echoed not just with the physical sounds of agony, but with the psychic screams of minds under siege, with the subtle yet devastating realization that even the mightiest cannot always shield those they love from the creeping decay of corruption. By the time the collapse had run its course, the first custodian was no longer recognizable as the being he had once been. Twisted limbs, armored plating fused to malformed flesh, glowing green eyes, and a psychic scream that resonated through the hall marked him as something other than human, a puppet of Typhus's malevolent will. The remaining custodians stared horrified, not just at the physical monstrosity, but at the realization of the moral and strategic nightmare they now faced. To strike him down was to destroy one of their own, an act of mercy or pragmatism depending on perspective. To hesitate was to risk their own corruption, to invite the unseen enemy to claim another mind, another body. In the tension of that choice, in the horror of witnessing transformation, the narrative established the psychological and moral stakes that would define the next phase of the story. Suspense, dread, and emotional turmoil intertwined in a single devastating tableau, leaving both characters and audience poised on the knife edge between survival and annihilation, loyalty and betrayal, sanity and horror.
The infection, once ignited in the first custodian, spread with a quiet inevitability, invisible yet unstoppable. The spores moved silently, drifting along the polished marble floors, clinging to golden armor, finding purchase in the smallest cracks and crevices of the palace corridors. The emperor, seated upon the golden throne, felt the first tremors of psychic disturbance ripple through the warp. They were faint at first, whispers at the edge of his consciousness, subtle distortions that suggested a breach of order within the sanctity of his palace. Yet even as he stretched his perception, he could not locate the source precisely. Typhus's corruption was cunning, infiltrating the custodians one by one, evading direct detection, slipping like smoke through the psychic barriers that had long protected the emperor's inner sanctum. The tension in the halls became almost unbearable. Each custodian moved with discipline, yet a shadow of doubt, an unseen weight clung to their movements. Their minds, honed to detect threats in every pattern, sensed the invisible enemy, but it was as though the very air around them had become a weapon, an agent of fear and madness that could not be struck, blocked, or deflected. As the spores took hold in additional custodians, the first signs of transformation became apparent. It began subtly. Twitches in a hand, the slight faltering of a step, a shimmer in the normally unwavering gaze. The golden armor seemed to vibrate unnaturally against the body, as if responding to an internal alien rhythm. The whispers intensified, threading doubt and paranoia into the minds of those still untainted. "Who can you trust?" they murmured, faint and almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable in their psychic resonance. The custodians who had witnessed the first collapse now faced an impossible choice: attempt to cleanse the corruption from their brothers, or strike them down before the transformation could fully take hold. Some acted instinctively, halting their advance to restrain the infected, only to be struck by sudden bursts of psychic energy that warped flesh, cracked armor, and tore at muscle and sinew. Others drew weapons with rigid precision, poised to strike if the corruption attempted to extend further. Every motion was amplified, every decision weighted with life and death consequences, and the hallways echoed with a rhythm of tension and dread that was almost physical, pressing on the minds of all present. The spread was relentless. One custodian turned on another in a flash of green-tainted horror, a clawed hand striking through plate armor with brutal efficiency, tearing flesh in a spray of ichor and sparks from disrupted energy fields. The golden halls, once a testament to discipline and perfection, became a battlefield of loyalty versus survival, of love versus fear, of order versus chaos. Screams mingled with psychic distortions, a symphony of agony that reverberated in every corner of the throne world. The emperor, his mind straining to maintain control, attempted to intervene, sending ripples of psychic energy to contain the corruption. Yet it was as though the warp itself had become a living conduit for Typhus's malevolence, resisting every effort, warping perception, and intensifying the terror.
Custodians fell one by one, sometimes by the hands of their brothers, sometimes by the slow, inevitable corruption overtaking their bodies from within. Each death was a cacophony of horror. Golden armor bent and shattered, blood sprayed across the walls, limbs contorted beyond natural angles, eyes wide with terror as the mind fractured under the psychic assault. The hallways became a scene of unimaginable carnage. Clawed limbs tore through bodies, psychic energy arced through the air in jagged green lightning, warping flesh in ways that defied comprehension. Custodians who had been paragons of perfection were reduced to grotesque shadows of themselves, mutating into monstrous forms that retained only fragments of their original discipline. The scene was chaotic, yet there was method to the madness. Each transformation was deliberate, each act of violence both a tool of Typhus's spread and a psychological assault on the survivors. The whispers in the warp continued, subtle yet persistent, feeding fear and mistrust. Every custodian questioned the intentions of his brethren. A glance, a hesitation, a fleeting twitch could mean betrayal. The tension was suffocating, a psychic fog that weighed on every decision, every movement, and every breath. Amidst the chaos, the witnesses not just physical horror, but the moral and emotional torment of the remaining custodians. They are warriors trained to perfection, yet now faced with a scenario that defies logic and reason. To strike down a brother is to violate the sacred oath of loyalty. To hesitate is to risk death and corruption. Some falter, paralyzed by indecision, their minds assaulted by the whispers that promise despair and betrayal. Others act swiftly, their actions violent and precise, yet each strike carries with it the burden of moral compromise, leaving a mark on the soul as even as it protects the body. The balance between survival and fidelity is razor thin, and the suspense of who will succumb next, who will turn on whom, and who might still be saved, permeates every moment.
The Emperor, sensing the psychic cacophony, perceives the breadth of the horror, but is constrained by his own physical limitations, the delicate machinery of the throne, and the intricacies of maintaining the psychic defenses of Terra. He feels the pain of each custodian, the betrayal of perfection by corruption, the slow erosion of his guardian's unity. It is a torment unlike any battle of weapons or strategy. It is the intimate agony of helplessness, of witnessing the failure of what was thought unbreakable. Yet even in this moment, there is a cruel beauty. The remaining custodians, aware of the inevitable, fight not only for their own survival, but to protect the Emperor, even as the corruption spreads around them. Their bravery, their discipline, and their fleeting human compassion are highlighted against the grotesque backdrop of mutation and death, intensifying the horror and the emotional resonance for the audience. By the time the spread reaches its climax in this sequence, the hallways are unrecognizable. The golden corridors are stained with blood, warped and contorted by psychic energy. Claw marks gouge the walls, ichor pools on the polished floors, and the once pristine banners hang in tatters. The whispers from the warp reach a crescendo, threading every heartbeat with fear and uncertainty. Every custodian, even those uninfected, moves with suspicion and dread, aware that the enemy could be hiding in Sign Place, that any gesture, any twitch could reveal the next betrayal. The audience is left breathless, caught between fascination and terror, invested not just in the spectacle of horror, but in the emotional stakes, the survival of golden guardians, the moral dilemmas of mercy and destruction, and the slow, inexorable advance of Typhus's malevolent will. The spread of corruption in these moments establishes the tone for the rest of the act, unrelenting, psychological, and visceral. The physical horror is mirrored by emotional strain, suspense, and dread. Loyalty and discipline are pitted against unseen, insidious corruption.
The remaining custodians must navigate a battlefield where every brother could be an enemy, where every action carries both moral and mortal consequences, and where the Emperor, omnipotent though he seems, cannot intervene fully. It is the perfect crucible for tension, suspense, and horror, leaving the audience on edge, fully aware that the situation will only worsen and that no one, not even the golden guardians of humanity, will emerge unscathed. Among the chaos and blood-soaked corridors, one custodian stood apart, not in virtue but in subtle corruption, the invisible mark of Typhus etched into his flesh and mind. He moved with the same perfection that had defined his entire existence, every step measured, every gesture flawless. Yet, beneath the golden veneer, the plague had already begun to rewrite his body and thoughts. His breathing was controlled, deliberate, betraying nothing of the greenish taint that pulsed beneath his skin. He glanced briefly at his brothers, some fallen, some fighting, some already corrupted beyond recognition, and felt the cold satisfaction of survival mingling with the creeping psychic whispers that promised more. Fear of discovery, of reprisal, and yet the thrill of secrecy twisted together in a dark symphony within him. Each footstep toward the Emperor's throne was careful, deliberate, a choreography of deception honed over centuries of discipline. The audience senses immediately that he is a hidden threat, and the tension rises because this custodian's proximity to the Emperor makes every motion, every decision exponentially more critical. The suspense is palpable, a knife edge that slices through the golden halls. He moved among his uninfected brothers, mirroring their actions flawlessly, even mimicking concern where none existed. A subtle nod here, a glance there, gestures of loyalty finely calculated to avoid suspicion, all masking the invisible decay that gnawed at his being. The whispers of the warp danced in his mind, coaxing and taunting, urging betrayal, painting images of glory and power should he succumb fully to Typhus's will. The psychic corruption was not merely biological, it was manipulative, insidious, threading doubt and desire into his thoughts with such subtlety that he almost convinced himself of his continued loyalty even as he plotted the inevitable collapse. Every glance at the Emperor, every step along the corridors carried the dual weight of worship and malice, a precarious balance that, if mismanaged, would mean immediate death and exposure. The audience feels the tension as though it were a tangible pressure. One wrong move, one twitch of suspicion, and the hidden horror would be revealed, shattering not only the custodian's life, but the security of the Emperor himself. The Emperor, seated upon the golden throne, radiated the aura of divinity and psychic power that had kept the Imperium stable for millennia, yet even he could not pierce the subtle camouflage of Typhus's corruption within this single custodian. His senses reached into the warp, but the cunning, localized taint cloaked itself, slipping past even the Emperor's immense vigilance. There was a cruel irony in the scene. The greatest mind in human history, the most powerful psychic in existence, watching helplessly as one of his most trusted protectors became an invisible threat at the heart of his domain. The tension is suffocating, amplified by the audience's awareness that the fate of the Emperor and perhaps the Imperium rests precariously upon the actions of a single golden warrior. Each silent heartbeat echoes with suspense, the warp-tinged whispers threading through both the corrupted custodian and the psychic awareness of the audience. As the corrupted custodian approached, subtle signs betrayed the slow corruption to the most perceptive observer, though not enough to provoke immediate suspicion. A slight hesitation in the step of another custodian nearby, a twitch of the fingers, a glimmer of unnatural light reflecting from the warped energy coursing beneath his armor. Each of these could have been interpreted as fatigue, stress, or the aftermath of battle, and yet the audience knows the truth. The whispers in the warp urged the hidden custodian forward, promising subtle manipulations and strategic betrayals that could sow discord and destruction at the highest levels. He could almost feel the psychic tendrils of Typhus wrapping around his mind, enhancing his cunning, sharpening his focus, and amplifying the thrill of concealment. Suspense builds not only from the danger posed by his proximity to the Emperor, but from the psychological torment and anticipation. The audience waits for the moment when loyalty will falter and betrayal will be enacted in the golden halls. The other custodians, despite their training and awareness, sensed something was amiss but could not pinpoint the threat.
Their vigilance became obsessive, scanning the ranks of their brothers, watching for hesitation, for imperfection, for signs that the corruption had spread. Every glance was a potential accusation. Every motion could provoke a fight or reveal the hidden taint. The hidden custodian moved with calculated precision, using these suspicions as camouflage, mirroring the movements of his fellows, interacting with them in ways that reinforced his facade of loyalty. He even performed minor rituals and gestures of devotion toward the emperor, each act a deception, masking the hidden growth of corruption within. The audience experiences a heightened suspense here, knowing the truth while watching the delicate dance of perception, deception, and psychic manipulation unfold. As the corrupted custodian reached the outer edges of the throne chamber, the corrupted custodian's heartbeat remained steady, controlled by centuries of training, even as the plague writhed beneath his flesh, subtly warping tendons and joints, bending the body in ways just enough to remain unnoticed. The whispers in the warp were now near constant companions, suggesting micro-actions, small deviations in loyalty that could escalate into open betrayal when the time was right. The audience is made to feel the tension as every micro-movement could be fatal. A glance too long at a fellow custodian, a slight hesitation before kneeling in respect to the emperor, a barely perceptible change in stance, all signs that could alert the others to the hidden corruption. The suspense is psychological, physical, and emotional, and it hangs over the throne chamber like a storm ready to break.
The emperor, serene yet perceptive, felt the subtle anomaly in the psychic weave around him. It was almost imperceptible, a whisper in the psychic flow, but it was there. A distortion, a vibration, a flicker of something that did not belong. Yet the emperor could not intervene directly. The corruption had hidden itself beneath layers of cunning, patience, and psychic misdirection. The tension was immense. The audience could sense the potential for catastrophe, understanding that the custodian's hidden infection posed not only a physical threat, but a profound emotional and moral danger. The eventual betrayal would be both violent and intimate, striking at the very heart of the emperor's protection and shattering the trust that had endured millennia. In these moments, the golden halls became a crucible of suspense. Every step of the hidden custodian, every flicker of movement, every whispered thought from the warp amplified the tension. The remaining uncorrupted custodians, unaware of the imminent threat, continued their duties, blind to the danger lurking so close to the emperor. The audience, however, is acutely aware of the stakes. One misstep, one glance, one hesitation, and the hidden custodian could unleash devastation at the core of the Imperium. The suspense is nearly unbearable, threaded through the psychic tension, the visible carnage from the spread of the plague, and the emotional resonance of loyalty under siege. By the end of this sequence, the scene is set for the inevitable betrayal. The custodian's infection, carefully hidden, has placed the emperor and his remaining loyal guards in a position of extreme vulnerability. Every glance, every breath, every action carries both dramatic tension and emotional weight. The audience is left at the edge of their seats, knowing that the coming act will be defined by horror, betrayal, and the ultimate test of loyalty and survival, setting the stage perfectly for the next devastating sequence in this grimdark narrative. The throne room, usually a sanctuary of divine order and calm, erupted into chaos as the infected custodians turned violently against their loyal brethren. Golden armor, once pristine and shining, became streaked with blood and twisted by gnarled claws, the gleam of metal reflecting the sickly green glow of plague corruption. Screams echoed off the vaulted ceilings, bouncing back as distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and crawl along the walls, warping reality with each psychic lash. Loyal custodians fought desperately, their weapons striking with lethal precision, yet each blow risked shattering not just flesh and armor, but the brotherhood that had endured for centuries. The emperor, sensing the psychic onslaught, unleashed waves of destructive power, arcs of psychic energy tearing through the corrupted forms with flashes of blinding light. Even so, the corruption moved with cunning, evading his defenses and spreading like a malignant storm. The hall became a twisted battlefield of horror, friends slain by friends, the clash of golden blades marred by blackened blood, and the wails of those caught between loyalty and transformation. Every motion was saturated with terror, every breath heavy with dread, as the audience witnessed the collapse of perfection under the inexorable tide of plague and betrayal. Amid the carnage, moments of profound emotional intensity emerged, exposing the fragile humanity beneath the Custodians' golden exterior. Loyal warriors, recognizing their inevitable transformation, fell to their knees before the throne, begging the Emperor for mercy, pleading to die before the corruption could consume them fully. Tears pooled in the crevices of their helmets, voices quivering, carrying raw fear, despair, and defiance all at once. One custodian pressed his hands to the Emperor's throne, his armor streaked with blood, whispering a final plea to spare humanity's symbol, yet sacrifice himself before becoming a monster. Others shouted warnings to their brothers, their last breaths ragged as they were torn apart by the infected. The juxtaposition of unflinching loyalty and inescapable death intensified the horror for the audience, creating empathy and deep emotional engagement. Each plea, each act of self-sacrifice underscored the stakes. This was not only a physical battle, but a moral and emotional one, where the preservation of the Emperor's vision came at the unbearable cost of the lives and souls of his most trusted guardians. Shadows stretched and twisted unnaturally around these moments, emphasizing despair and making the room itself seem complicit in the unfolding nightmare. Through the flickering chaos, a psychic tremor heralded Typhus's presence, subtle at first, yet almost imperceptible, yet profoundly sinister. He did not walk openly at first. His influence seeped into the corridors like a miasma, the whispers threading into minds with poisonous cadence. Even your angels can fall. Even the perfect can be broken. The Custodians sensed the unseen threat, dread coiling like a living thing in their chests, yet the true scale of the horror remained hidden. Typhus's psychic taint warped perception, shadows lengthened, light fractured, and the room felt impossibly large and impossibly small simultaneously, a labyrinth of fear and inevitability. The audience experiences suspense at its zenith. The Golden Guardians, already fractured, now face the promise of a confrontation with the Plague Lord himself, a being whose malevolence dwarfs even the mightiest defenders. Every heartbeat resonates with anticipation, every glance over a shoulder suggests imminent betrayal, and every movement of the corrupted Custodians signals impending doom. The stage is set for the ultimate clash of loyalty, horror, and divine power, leaving viewers tense and horrified as they await the inevitable confrontation that will define the fate of the Emperor and his golden throne.
The throne room descended into utter chaos as desperation overtook the remaining loyal Custodians. They fought with every ounce of strength and training, yet each strike carried the weight of moral torment. Every swing of a blade risked killing a brother corrupted beyond recognition, yet leaving them alive risked their own infection. Golden armor gleamed with blood and warped flesh, reflections twisted in the pool of gore that coated the floor. Psychic energy arced violently through the hall, unleashed in frantic defense by the Emperor as his power sought to push back the tide of corruption. The screams of the fallen were punctuated by whispers from the warp, voices promising salvation in surrender and power in betrayal. Fear hung thick in the air, and even the most disciplined Custodians faltered under the weight of indecision, the horror of seeing comrades twisted into monstrosities beyond recognition gnawing at their minds.
Every move became a gamble, every strike a moral and physical trial, as the Emperor's guardians teetered on the razor edge between duty and death. The audience feels suffocating dread, caught between the visceral horror of gore and the emotional anguish of warriors forced to fight their own brothers. Amid the turmoil, moments of heart-rending sacrifice illuminated the human core beneath the gold and perfection. Some custodians, recognizing the creeping corruption within themselves, collapsed before the Emperor and begged for death, tears mixing with blood streaked on their armor. "End this for me, my lord. Let me not harm you," they whispered, their voices trembling with fear and despair. Others, though still untainted, chose to shield their dying comrades, holding them as they succumbed to the plague, even as their own limbs were clawed and torn by the infected. The psychic screams and gory visuals were counterbalanced by these intimate, emotional moments, giving the audience a profound sense of empathy and horror. The juxtaposition of loyalty, fear, and self-sacrifice heightened the stakes, making the carnage not just a spectacle of violence, but a tragedy of morality and devotion. Each plea, each act of selflessness reverberated through the hall, underscoring the human cost of failure and the unbearable weight of duty in the face of overwhelming corruption. Through the blood and chaos, Typhus's presence became undeniable. His form did not fully manifest at first, remaining partially cloaked in psychic distortion, shadows writhing unnaturally around him as he moved. His whispered taunts penetrated minds, a corrosive lullaby. "Even your angels can fall. Even your perfect guardians can betray you." The surviving custodians felt the full scope of terror, their loyalty tested as the whispers suggested subterfuge even among themselves. The Emperor's psychic might surged in response, yet even he could not fully purge the taint that now saturated the throne room. Suspense reached its peak. Every movement of the corrupted custodians, every flicker of shadow, every pulse of psychic energy hinted at the inevitability of betrayal and death. The audience is drawn into this tense web of fear, anticipating the coming clash with Typhus and sensing the fragility of even the most divine power in the face of insidious, relentless corruption. The stage is set for devastation, horror, and ultimate moral collapse as the final confrontation looms.
The throne room had become a crucible of fire, blood, and psychic distortion. The golden splendor of the Emperor's guardians shattered under the relentless tide of corruption. Every step echoed with screams. Every swing of a weapon tore flesh and armor alike, and the air pulsed with the malignant whispers of Typhus. The Emperor, seated upon his throne, radiated a psychic presence that could have shattered worlds, yet even he struggled to contain the relentless infection that had infiltrated his closest protectors. The surviving custodians, some untainted, others barely clinging to their loyalty, fought with desperate fury, blades clashing with the corrupted, armor denting under blows that seemed impossible. The psychic energy in the hall twisted reality, bending shadows and refracting light into shapes both grotesque and hallucinatory. For a moment, it seemed as though the throne room itself might collapse, consumed by the war between perfect loyalty and the creeping horror of Typhus's will. The audience feels a suffocating dread as chaos and fear interlace with heroism and desperation, creating a climax of horror that tests both the physical and moral limits of every character in the scene. Amid the carnage, flickers of sacrifice and redemption emerged, small beacons of hope in a sea of horror. Some custodians, sensing the corruption rising within themselves, threw themselves upon the enemy, weapons swinging in wide arcs, ensuring that their final acts destroyed as many infected as possible before death claimed them. Their armor was streaked with blood, both their own and that of their brothers, and their cries were both a warning and a prayer.
Others formed shields around the emperor, bodies pressed together to block any approach of the corrupted, knowing that their lives might end at any moment, yet willing to die to buy him time. In these moments, the audience experiences a powerful emotional resonance. Horror is not only in the gore and psychic chaos, but in the courage, loyalty, and self-sacrifice of beings designed to be perfect, yet profoundly human in their devotion. Each act of heroism contrasts with the grotesque violence around them, highlighting both the stakes and the tragedy, as hope flickers in the darkness even when all seems lost. Finally, Typhus revealed himself fully, stepping from the shadows into the full view of the throne room. His form shimmered with psychic corruption, a monstrous visage of decay and power, eyes glowing with malevolent intellect. "Even your angels can fall," he whispered, the words vibrating through the warp and piercing the minds of the remaining custodians. The Emperor responded with a psychic fury that bent light and shadow, energy arcs searing the hall. Yet the cost was clear. Even his might could not erase the horror fully. Some custodians fell to corruption, others to sacrificial combat, and the Emperor's own aura seemed strained, a godly being wrestling with limitations even against the most insidious enemy. The audience is left at the peak of suspense, devastation and despair intertwined with moments of redemption, loyalty tested to the last, the horror both physical and emotional. The throne room, once a symbol of absolute order, now stands as a testament to the fragility of perfection in the face of relentless corruption, leaving the viewers with shock, awe, and the haunting weight of grimdark inevitability.